So we are now officially launching this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, good afternoon to who is with us at the conference of the parties to the Convention of Wetlands at the International Conference Center here in Geneva. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx or is now watching the video of the event. We have the pleasure to welcome you today for a side event to the Conference of the Parties to the Ramsar Convention, which is entitled Unpacking the Potential of Wetlands for Addressing Climate Change and Biodiversity Loss. This side event is organized by IUCN with the support of the Geneva Environment Network. I will now let you in the hands of James Dalton, who is the head for water and land management at IUCN, and he will be the chair of this session.
Great, many thanks, and good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are. Welcome to this session. We have 60 minutes to discuss the role of wetlands to address climate change and biodiversity loss, and in particular, the role of nature-based solutions within that. We will look at a little bit in terms of what nature-based solutions offer and how wetlands are champion ecosystems in contributing to both that biodiversity and climate and water security agenda. And this is very much in line with the theme of this particular COP on wetlands action for people and nature. So the relevance is high for this particular topic. And we hope that out of the course of this session and the fact that you get to hear from both policy and practitioners, that it will also help inform you further in terms of how NBS is actually helping to deliver the convention. We also have an amazing array of wonderful project names present with us today, and you will hear those over the course of this afternoon. Right, so first off, I'd like to introduce Ms. Sonia Koppel. She's the Secretary of the Water Convention for the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and she's going to talk a little bit about NBS within the Water Convention. Sonia, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to talk to you today about the Convention on the Protection and Use of Transboundary Watercourses and International Lakes, and how it includes nature-based solutions and wetlands and the interrelation with the Ramsar Convention. And if you can go to the next slide. As probably most of you know, nature-based solutions provide multiple benefits to society, economy, and environment. And we will hear from some of the other speakers today. They include increasing climate resilience, promoting disaster risk reduction, carbon storage, biodiversity, recreation, etc. But I would like to draw your attention to a particular effect, which is that the majority of the freshwater worldwide, more than 60% of freshwater flow, occurs in basins shared by 2 or more countries. And actually, there are also many transboundary Ramsar sites. So cooperating in these situations is crucial for ecosystem and climate resilience and for sustainably managing water, but also even for promoting peace, preventing conflicts, and promoting sustainable development. And actually, nature-based solutions can often bring multiple benefits for all riparian countries. They offer even an opportunity to initiate and strengthen transboundary water cooperation and thereby contribute to regional peace and regional integration. And we have seen a number of positive examples from around the world. For example, Danube-Rhine in the Pan-European region, Sixa-Ola in Central America, or the Mekong in Chutalas in Asia. And I will speak a little bit in one example a bit later. So on the next slide, you can see indeed the number of transboundary basins around the world, many of which also include wetlands or even transboundary wetlands. Then on the next slide, the Water Convention, the Convention on the Protection and Use of Transboundary Watercourses and International Lakes, is now a global legal and intergovernmental instrument and platform which aims to prevent and control and reduce transboundary impacts. It asks the parties to use waters in an equitable and reasonable way, shared water resources, and to cooperate by setting up agreements and joint bodies. but it's also a platform in the United Nations system to discuss such transboundary waters, with more than 130 countries and more than 30 river basin organizations participating. Currently, there are 47 parties, with the latest one, Cameroon, which just joined last week, and more than 15 countries in the accession process. So the Water Convention addresses political and technical challenges and supports policy processes and technical cooperation. And on the next slide, you can see that actually ecosystem conservation, restoration is at the heart of the Water Convention. It's one of the main obligations. So countries are asked to ensure conservation and, where necessary, restoration of ecosystems. And even in the early years of the convention, 10, 20 years ago, there was a lot of work on this topic, on exactly on nature-based solutions, with several workshops happening on this topic, publications such as recommendations on payment for ecosystem services in integrated water resources management. And then in the last few, and also we had a lot of cooperation with the Ramsar Convention. And then lately, those activities, we have a lot been working on this in the framework of our climate change activities, such as in the Global Network of Basins working on climate change, which includes 18 basins worldwide, and also through some events, such as a global workshop on ecosystem-based adaptation in transboundary basins. So I already mentioned that one of the activities of the Water Convention are also activities in transboundary basins, and one is the Dniester Basin, as you can see on the next slide, which is shared by the Republic of Moldova and Ukraine. And here it's providing major sources of drinking water, but also a huge biodiversity, has huge biodiversity and transboundary wetlands. And here the countries have approached us already in 2006, OSCE and UNECE together, to help them work on developing a transboundary agreement, setting up a joint commission, which was created in 2018, but also developing a joint adaptation plan to climate change, and actually to implement some adaptation measures, including some ecosystem-based adaptation measures, such as restoration of floodplains, etc. Those measures have really brought forward and enhanced transboundary cooperation more broadly. On the next slide, you can indeed see some of those outcomes from the work. And in the Dniester agreement, actually, ecosystem and wetland restoration is quite prominent. There's even a working group also on this topic, and it's included quite strongly also in the river-based management plans. This is just one example. Similar activities are happening in other basins in the global network, and the Water Convention promotes their implementation. Now, I would like to point out that the Water Convention also has a protocol, a so-called Protocol on Water and Health, which aims to ensure, as you can see on the next slide, basically to enable access to water and sanitation for all, and prevention of water-related diseases through better water management, better sanitation, better environmental management, co-serviced by UNECE and WHO Europe. And ecosystem is also restoration is also a part of this protocol. The sixth session of the meeting of the parties will be held next week in Geneva, with which will provide also input to the United Nations Water Conference to be held on 22nd to 24 March next year in New York. And the protocol exactly also promotes this One Health approach. And the high-level segment, as you can see on the next slide, which will be held on basically 16 November, exactly focuses on strengthening the resilience of WASH, so water sanitation, health and hygiene, and health services in times of climate change and pandemic. And we'll discuss good practices of adaptation of WASH services to climate change, but also how water was and is still important to prevent future pandemics, and the role of the protocol in this regard. And several high-level participants will take part, several of your countries, and invite all of you also to join either in person or online in this meeting. With this, thank you very much, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Great, thank you very much, Sonia. So absolutely fascinating, the delivery of transboundary cooperation through restoration to lead to peaceful development and coexistence. It sounds like the convention is doing excellent work across the world as we work together and collaborate anyhow. So keep any questions in mind. We'll move now online to Mr. Jacob Weichert. Jacob, apologies if I'm damaging your name. He's a Senior Policy Officer for DG Environment from the European Commission. And he's going to talk to us about linking the first presentation on policy and restoration, transboundary governance. We move now on to EU restoration law. Jacob, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much, James. And thanks for the introduction. And thanks for having my slides put up for me. I'm going to tell you about our proposal from the European Commission on a nature restoration law. This proposal for this law came out in June this year and is now, as part of the institutional process, being discussed jointly with Council, the European Council and Parliament. The objective of the law is to restore ecosystems across the board in the EU. It forms part, if I could have the next slide, please. It forms part essentially of the European Commission's thrust on the European Green Deal. And you can see that protecting and restoring nature is a cornerstone of some of the various strategies of the European Green Deal, which include other aspects of greening, such as promoting clean energy, on climate, combating climate change, and a number of others. If I could have the next slide, please. A basis for proceeding on a proposal on the nature restoration law stemmed from the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, which came out about 2 years ago. Essentially, this outlined 4 key pillars for the EU to address the loss of biodiversity and to bring nature back into our lives. And that is, those 4 pillars are: 1 is on protecting nature. Another aspect is on restoring nature. There's also a pillar on enabling transformative change, which is about involving businesses and communities in the transformation and of improving the state of nature, as well as the EU's role in the global agenda. And if I come back to the first 2 points on protecting nature and restoring nature, I mean, basically the proposal in the biodiversity strategy has been that we, in the EU anyway, we need to extend the areas of protection. And the proposal is to extend that up to 30% of protected of areas to be protected, and a core of 10% to be strictly protected. Now, part of the analysis of the biodiversity strategy pointed out that protection on its own is not enough. You really need to also have active work on restoring nature, on bringing back the health of ecosystems, both within protected areas and outside. And another aspect, I think, that was a clear conclusion of the biodiversity strategy was that voluntary approaches that have been attempted at EU level to restore nature since the previous biodiversity strategy, which came out in 2010, have not been sufficient. They've been very necessary. They've been extremely helpful, and there are a large range of projects, such as funded under the LIFE programs, or the Horizon research programs in the EU, or many others, that have contributed to restoration. What the conclusion of the strategy is that those were necessary but not sufficient to address the problems and the scale of the threats to biodiversity and to ecosystem degradation within the EU. So if I could have the next slide, please. There is, of course, also the international context, which we're also working in, and that's particularly the CBD, the Convention of Biodiversity, COP15, to be being held in Montreal later this year, where restoration is an important aspect. There's also the UN Decade on Restoration, which is from now to 2030, and a number of other work such as the Sustainable Development Goals and also other aspects such as the UNFCCC, Ramsar Convention, and a lot of other international activities. So we're working within that context. If I could have the next slide, please. As I said, within the EU, there have been a lot of restoration projects, and there are ongoing restoration projects in the EU, and there will be many more in the future. A lot of these are, as I said, based on some LIFE projects funding, under research project funding. Many have combined nature-based solutions together with restoration as various forms of basically bringing back nature, but also bringing the benefits of restoration to society or to local groups and to local communities. So I still want to emphasize, though, that the conclusion of the biodiversity strategy was that although highly important in showing the way, in developing methods and developing ways of restoring, developing know-how on how to restore, has been truly very important, both within the EU, and there are many projects worldwide as well that are developing know-how. But within the EU context, these have been, as I said, necessary, but not sufficient to address the problems of the scale that we're facing on biodiversity loss. If I could have the next slide, please. Just to give you thank you. An overview of the proposal for the nature restoration regulation. First of all, it sets an overarching objective to restore certain areas of the EU by 2030, 2040, 2050. And then, very importantly, it sets out a set of specific restoration targets across a number of ecosystems. James, you mentioned that wetlands are a champion ecosystem. We would very much agree with that. But there are many other champions from other perspectives, including forests, including marine ecosystems, including grasslands, including agro-ecosystems, and others. Now, clearly, wetlands play a huge role. The restoration of wetlands plays a huge role in not only for nature's sake, but also from the perspective of natural ways of both absorbing and storing carbon, as well as other benefits such as water purification, etc. But coming back to the structure, so we have a set of targets for different ecosystem types, and then we have an implementation framework in the proposal, which is essentially based on national restoration plans. So each member state in the EU will have to develop plans of how to reach some of the targets that are set in the legislation, how, where, and with what local communities and what regional specificities. That is delegated, or in a kind of more formal language, there's a high degree of subsidiarity delegated to the member states, because obviously a lot of restoration has to take place on the ground or on the sea in local and regional situations. Could I have the next slide, please? So just a minute on this, and then I'll pretty well finish my slides. essentially just to go through some of the main restoration targets. So a lot are based on the Annex 1 of the Habitats Directive. So this is a directive, the Habitats Directive has been in place for a number of years, but it doesn't have any time-bound targets. The advantage is that it has a lot of definitions for habitat types, and it covers the Annex 1 habitats cover about 25% or more of EU area. But then moving beyond that, there are other areas, such as certain marine habitats that will go beyond, that we're proposing should go beyond that, such as soft sediments. And then a whole raft of other targets and objectives that go beyond those, include and go beyond those areas, such as on urban ecosystems, importantly, trying to green more urban areas, have a greater amount of tree coverage. On river connectivity, relevant also to this audience, about the removal of barriers and the objective, as stated in the biodiversity strategy, of having 25,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers in the EU by the removal, for example, of obsolete barriers. There's also targets on pollinators, also specific requirements on the improvement of certain biodiversity indicators, both for agroecosystems and forest ecosystems. Now, within the Annex 1 habitats, there's quite a lot of wetlands that are actually covered by those descriptions, and there are targets for those, so that basically the targets for those essentially suggest that any of those ecosystems that are in unknown or bad condition should be converted to good condition, with 30% done so by 2030, 40%, 50% by 2040, and getting close to 90% by 2050. So that gives you a scale of the breadth of the proposal, that of course includes wetlands, it includes riverine ecosystems, includes freshwater ecosystems, but obviously includes other ecosystems as well. If I could have the next slide, and I think that's pretty well my conclusion. Thanks very much for your attention on that, and happy to have a discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jacob, and to Sonia as well for framing that from a policy perspective. I just wondered if anyone has any questions on those two presentations before we move on. Just we can take one or two right now if there are. I have a point to raise, Jacob, just to congratulate you on the point that you've got in there, river connectivity, and it's per kilometre, that you've got a target for kilometres rather than it being just an aerial extent for river connectivity, which is great to hear, great to see. So that's a big success from my side. Anybody else, any points they want to make at this stage before we move on? Okay, let's carry on then. So we've heard a little bit about the policy framing. Now we're going to hear a little bit about what that means on the ground from projects actually delivering. Some of the financial mechanisms that Jacob mentioned there are actually mobilizing a series of projects on the ground, and we're going to hear about some of those that are funded focusing on nature-based solutions. This is where we get to the wonderful project names. So now I'd like to introduce Professor Jeremy Biggs. He's the CEO of the Freshwater Habitats Trust. He's also a visiting professor at Oxford Brookes University, and he is a project partner for the project called Ponderful. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, and hello everyone. I'm Jeremy Biggs of the Freshwater Habitats Trust in the UK, representing the EU Horizon 2020 funded Ponderful project. And today I'm going to talk to you about the critical role of ponds as nature-based solutions for addressing climate change and biodiversity loss. When we talk about wetlands, we naturally think of big places like the Cota Doñana in Spain or the Pantanal in South America. But numerically, most wetlands are small, like this natural pond in the Scottish Highlands, this man-made field pond in France, or this Mediterranean temporary pond in Sardinia in Italy. Most of the world's running waters are small as well, about 80% we think. And of the world's standing waters, about 90% are less than 1 hectare in area. And it's these small standing waters that Ponderful is concerned with. with the project focusing on how ponds can be used as nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation and mitigation. Ponds are water bodies between 1 metre square and about 5 hectares in area, which hold water for 4 months of the year or more, though just notice the upper size limit used by Ramsar is slightly larger. But for policymakers and conservation organisations, what's particularly interesting about ponds is evidence which has been building over the last 20 years that showing these habitats are absolutely critical for supporting freshwater biodiversity. So, although it may seem extraordinary, at a landscape level, they support even more species than rivers. This is the original data we collected on this in the UK, which has been replicated in continental Europe, in Denmark, Germany, and France, and recently in China too, and it seems likely that this pattern will be global. The problem is this knowledge that small waters are really important has come rather late, with freshwater science traditionally focused on big rivers and lakes. Now we are realizing that unknowingly, a systematic bias against small waters has built up in policy for small streams and headwaters, but particularly for ponds. A good practical example of this is the EU's Water Framework Directive, which in theory protects all fresh waters, but in practice excludes virtually all water bodies less than 50 hectares, so all ponds and many small lakes. So there's without doubt an urgent need to include policies that correct these old biases and give urgent protection to small water bodies. In Ponderful, we're also looking forward and focusing on the nature-based solutions for the future that ponds provide, especially for biodiversity and climate regulation. Now, I don't have time today to discuss the individual nature-based solutions we're working on, but I will highlight 2 examples of how ponds can help to provide a rapid and powerful solution for freshwater biodiversity loss. The first example is for amphibians here in Switzerland, where it's recently been reported that after decades of declines, large-scale pond creation over 20 years led to increases in 10 out of 12 amphibian species found in the Argo canton. You can see it on the map behind me. And it's a great example of the benefits of a simple but large-scale nature-based solution using ponds. The second example is from one of Ponderful's demonstration sites. This one's in the UK, where in a typical lowland farmed landscape, that's losing 1% of its freshwater plant species every single year, we added new clean water ponds. And that led to a 25% increase in whole landscape wetland plant biodiversity, that's the top graph, and a roughly 200% increase in the occurrence of rare species. Now, this is an unprecedented level of change in landscape level freshwater biodiversity. No other freshwater interventions that we've seen, river restoration, buffer zones, pollution interception, wetlands, shows anything like this landscape level scale benefit. And these 2 examples show that ponds can be really effective nature-based solutions for freshwater biodiversity protection, with the potential to have a strong protective effect, especially in the face of climate change. So to finish, I want to mention how in partnership with other Horizon 2020 projects, Ponderful is working with policymakers to propose 2 urgent developments. First, to ensure that the Water Framework Directive applies its System B classification, which does include ponds. This would be a huge step forward. And secondly, to adopt simple and robust pond policies. For example, to undertake a massive pond creation programme and include this in the nature restoration law alongside efforts to protect rivers. And we're proposing key texts for this work, which you can read on the slide behind me. So thank you very much. That's a very quick introduction to what Ponderful's doing and the work we're doing to use ponds as nature-based solutions for biodiversity and climate change. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jeremy. I've learned a lot in 5 minutes there in terms of small water bodies and some direct messaging to Jacob as well. So I hope that he's still online with us. So let's move on to the second project. We're going to hear now from Arnaud Therese. Arnaud is the project officer for Plan Bleu, and he is also a project partner for another interesting sounding project called Waterlands. Over to you, Arnaud.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, James. Good afternoon to you all, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. So I will present you a little bit what Waterlands is about, and we'll talk about also restoration of wetlands and engaging with communities. So first of all, I would like to introduce the organization Plan Bleu. It's a regional activity center of the Mediterranean Action Plan of the UN Environment Program. We're based in Marseille, and we were born about 40 years ago as a systemic and prospective analysis center in the Mediterranean. We also host the MEDEC Secretariat, which is a network of Mediterranean experts on climate and environmental change. And we're very much involved on several aspects. I would highlight especially the Mediterranean Observatory on the environment and development to enlighten decision makers, and monitoring the implementation of the Mediterranean Strategy for Sustainable Development, as well as supporting transition towards a green and blue economy, which really what Waterlands is about. So at a glance, Waterlands is a project funded by the European Horizon 2020 Green Deal program. It's part of a call on restoring biodiversity and ecosystem services. The project officially started in 2021 and is running until 2026. It's coordinated by the University College of Dublin and has a consortium of 32 partners, including Plan Bleu, and from 14 countries, from research, industry, public authorities, and NGOs. And we're very much looking at how we can achieve a deeper understanding of the opportunities and challenges for wetland restoration at a continental scale in the EU. So in terms of project objectives and work package linkages and especially the vision, we are trying to support decision makers, local communities, and restoration practitioners to intensify cooperation towards the large-scale restoration of wetlands in Europe through those 7 objectives that you see on the screen. From aligning governance to fostering community engagement and mobilizing finance and restoration of wetlands. It's all about creating a legacy for after the project. So the project network, it's a wide network of sites. It has a really good coverage of Ramsar sites. With Doñana in Spain, Venice Lagoon in Italy, Stora Mossa in Sweden, Kulkhag Mountain in Ireland, and Dragon Marsh in Bulgaria, for example. So we've got 15 knowledge sites, which are sites where restoration has been ongoing, and there's knowledge and results that have been generated, and they will inform future restoration on the 6 action sites featured in the project, which will restore about 10,000 hectares of wetlands until the end of the project. But the goal is to demonstrate how restoration can be done at a large scale for the future. So nature-based solutions, wetland restorations is a perfect example of how nature-based solutions can help boosting biodiversity and bring value to society. I would like to stress here that wetland restoration is our best hope for mitigating and adapting to climate change impacts, as they bring valuable services that have already been highlighted by some of the speakers. I will not go through them again, but here I wanted to show you 2 examples of the sites that we are working with in Waterlands. We've got Abelix Bog, which is located in Ireland. It's a peatland which was degraded because of peat extraction, and it's a community-led restoration project, which is very inspiring actually, on 200 hectares, and major restoration works are ongoing right now. So now they're keeping the water in the landscape, and everything they do is science-based and evidence-based. So it's very it's wonderful in terms of how it binds the community together through science. Also, another example from Mediterranean ecosystem, the coastal ecosystem of Camargue, the former salt works. The former salt works were restored through renaturalization of the site with some hydrological works to improve gravitational water flows. And also the Mediterranean water cycle was restored, and the sea dike was abandoned and breached, so further retreating inland, so that the natural connection between the sea and the ponds and the marshes was reestablished, also allowing wildlife and fish population to migrate up and down. So here I would like to stress that the specific hydrological regime is crucial to restoring biodiversity and function and value in general. Restoration must begin by determining how hydrology has changed over time, and it's what we're trying to do in this project. Engaging communities, well, it's restoration work. Restoration doesn't work if people don't want to engage in this project. So how do we do that? Well, we very much involve communities in co-design and co-creation. It's all about large-scale wetland restoration initiatives, or what we call living labs, from well, wetlands in different stages of implementation across the EU, from unprotected wetlands with no measures to newly established wetlands where remediation works are just beginning, through finance plans at the verge of implementation, to fully implemented restoration efforts. Connectivity with communities, well, it's in design, implementation, and management, which is essential to the resilience of the projects in general. And also we try to tailor them to the socio-ecological conditionality of each site. And of course, by sharing ecological community, governance, and financial expertise, which is also what we saw before on the slide with the project objectives, the reshaping of attitudes to wetlands and the modes of their sustainable conservation exploitation can be affected. So linking to policy as well, and we saw the EU Nature Restoration Law presented by Jacob. I would like to mention here that the Waterlands will contribute to producing guidelines on upscaling restoration of wetlands, which will inform and support the EU Nature Restoration Law implementation, support decision makers in increasing wetlands target and ambition to lead to a transformation pathway. And here peatlands targets are very much welcomed, and we hope to work on these, as well as Mediterranean coastal ecosystems, and also to show that nature-based solutions cumulative benefits are exceeding the benefits of engineered solutions, grey infrastructures. I would like to thank you, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Arnaud, for that oversight of the things that are going on within the project. So finally, our last presenter, to Dr. Alessio Satta, who's the coordinator of the Mediterranean Wetlands Ramsar Regional Initiative. He's also a project partner for a project called Rest Coast, which to me sounds like a holiday destination. Yeah. But let's hear from you, Alessio, on your intervention, your project.
Thank you, James. Actually, after Ponderful and Waterland is quite difficult and challenging. You know, we are Rest Coast. It looks like sexy, but I will try to show you that at least we are really online in trying to achieve the same results. In a nutshell, you know, these are more or less, I would say, with Waterland, we're twin projects, very ambitious projects also in terms of partners. In the case of Rest Coast, we have 38 partners coordinated by the Universitat Politecnica de Catalunya, 12 countries represented, 80 million euros of budget, and 4 years of implementation. So we have 9 pilot sites. Some are Mediterranean, others are from the Baltic and the Black Sea. So which is our ambition? Our ambition is still on the large-scale restoration projects and how we can connect and create this continuum between river, delta, estuary, and coast and sea, so the so-called land-sea interactions. Of course, our objective is very much to the transition from the applied research to applied research and action. So this is very much what we will try to do, and also to demonstrate how large-scale restoration concretely contribute to climate mitigation and adaptation. So let's have a quick look on expected results. Of course, one of the, as I said before, the objective is connectivity. Connectivity through scalable adaptation through restoration plans that we call nature-based solution blocks. Coastal ecosystem services for risk reduction and biodiversity gains. And this is a specific, very specific aim. We need to have coastal protection with carbon neutralization. We need to decarbonize coastal protection, because also through hard infrastructure, hard works, you know that one of the issue is really how the footprint of this activity. So the scope is really to embed decarbonization in coastal protection. Replicable upscaling drive through systemic restoration of river delta estuary coast. We have two examples. One is the Venice Lagoon is very popular. It is not only a Ramsar site, but is one of the hotspots in the Mediterranean, let's say the hotspot in terms of climate vulnerability and risks. Then what we call enablers that are the coastal restoration platform for engagement of stakeholders, but as we will see later, also for going beyond the project. Integrate transition from local to regional pilots to worldwide coast. We have also the ambition to export the achievements of this project to other international partners through something that is quite innovative, a kind of cooperation board. So we don't want to just stay in the EU borders, but we really want to go beyond North Africa, South America, South Asia. And of course, we are open to any kind of collaboration. Sorry, too quick. So, and finally, governance. Governance. So again, through this restoration platform and through a tool that we call restoration contract, we want to achieve a better governance, bringing together different levels of decision. So this is another crucial point when you are implementing restoration and when you are implementing nature-based solution. But let me finish with something that it's happening now. What we realize at this COP is that there is not yet an agreed definition, understanding of nature-based solution now, especially on wetland restoration and conservation as nature-based solution. As you know, today, this afternoon, we are discussing a resolution 18.20 that is exactly on this. This is exactly on how we can also in our world, in the Ramsar world, we come with a share and harmonized definition with other conventions, and also especially with the resolution of UNEA on nature-based solution. I believe that it's very important to harmonize our convention with all the other conventions and with the work that has been presented so far. So please, I of course address my call to all the contracting parties that are here now, and please fight for this resolution and support us for getting full consensus. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alessio. So now we have the chance for questions from you as the audience. If you do have questions, please use the microphone and let us have your name and the institution or the country that you represent. And if your question is general or if it's targeted to any particular panelist, for example. So does anybody want to kick us off with a comment or a question on what you've heard today? Yes, please, at the back.
Okay, yeah. Hello, I'm Lisha. I'm an intern from UNEP, and I'm curious about the Ponderful project. As mentioned in that project, the projects mainly focus on the very small ponds in nature, and you are trying to make legislation on these ponds. But actually, there are many very small ponds, and if the climate becomes dry, those ponds will disappear. So how do you deal with those small ponds?
As the climate becomes drier, some ponds will get shallower and some may become dry. That's true, but there are so many of them that I'm worried about it, but I don't think it's catastrophic. And the way we deal with it is by making new ponds. We have big programs of making new ponds, which sounds like an artificial intervention, but actually ponds have been created by natural processes for millions of years. As long as there has been land and as long as there has been water, natural processes have been making small water bodies. And when we create them, we simply simulate that natural process. It is actually the epitome of a nature-based process. So they're so important that we will make new ones, essentially, but we do need, of course, to control climate change, because that's an enormous threat to all kinds of fresh waters, not just small water bodies. But I don't think it means that they're all going to disappear tomorrow. That's the important point, really.
Okay, thank you. So do you have a monitoring system for all the ponds in your projects?
We're doing some detailed investigations in a scientific sense of a lot of sites. We have a very big scientific program, but this is very different to national and international monitoring programs. Those are not well implemented globally or nationally yet. We have some. We're reasonable in the UK. We're quite good at it, but not that good. There are different European states who are quite good at small water bodies. Mostly monitoring systems don't properly take account of small water bodies, either ponds or running waters. This is part of the policy bias against small waters generally. We've just overlooked them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Ellen Krakauer-Hardegg from New York City and representing Society of Wetland Scientists Professional Certification Program. On this, again, to follow up on these small ponds, so many when you really look, may have been historically installed. Like, I understand the carp ponds here, and I know in New York City, when you look, they may have been remnants from old farming practices. Are you favoring the natural ones versus those? Are you exploring where there might be a connection that's been hidden, that it's really man-made? And how are you interested in maintaining that or letting them go and not be ponds anymore?
We would judge them mostly on their biodiversity interest. I mean, sometimes there are also cultural reasons for maintaining historic features in the landscape as well. And like you say, all over the industrialized world, there are lots of historic reasons that small water bodies have been made. But on the whole, as biologists, we would look first at what biodiversity benefits they're providing, because it doesn't really matter from a biodiversity sense how the hole in the ground has been made. It can take on an importance just because that's the way freshwaters are. They work as a network. Plants and animals from long-established ancient wetlands can colonize new ones quite quickly. So the origin isn't important, except where it's of special interest to you. But for biodiversity, I don't think it matters so much.
Lady at the back. No, okay, sorry, it was you. Yeah, go ahead. You were after her, but... Okay, go ahead. No, go ahead.
My name is Christiane from Austria, and I would like to know how the nature restoration law is going on, because now it's in discussion, and what are the next steps to the...
To Jacob.
Yeah.
Yep. Jacob, did you hear that question?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I mean, basically, we're in the stage of, as I said, June. The proposal was made at the end of June, 22nd of June, and since then already the council. So that's basically all the member states have been expressing views, asking various forms of questions, and then part of the procedures now is discussions with council and and also with Parliament, and that will be going on this year and into next year. it's impossible to say exactly, but a guess might be that towards the end of next year, one could see that the law could be adopted, or early 24. Then after that, it would be the start of implementation.
Okay, thanks, Jacob. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Jillian Davies from Massachusetts, USA, and I'm representing Society of Wetland Scientists and SWS Professional Certification Program. And my question for Jeremy is, how do you, in your site selection for ponds, how do you balance a potential impact to an intact ecosystem location? Do you really try to locate them in degraded landscape areas and different ponds? You know, for instance, like, how would you address creating a pond in a forested situation and balancing that with impact to the forest?
Okay. The central principle of our pond creation work in the UK, and I would say again in all countries with industrialized land management, farming or forestry, the central principle is that we use ponds to put back clean, unpolluted water in the landscape, because that's the scarcest resource for water in most parts of most industrialized landscapes, maybe different in more pristine locations. So we look for places where there's a catchment around the pond, which can be tiny. You know, we can make a clean water pond with a catchment the size of this room. We put the water bodies into places where they can drain, where clean water will drain into them. Now in forests, for us, they're quite a small part of. We do make ponds in forests as well. We have very disturbed forest ecosystems in the UK, of course. Though many are ancient, but they're also disturbed. And there's usually plenty of spaces which have been disturbed, but still have clean catchments generating clean water or comparatively clean water, where we can put those water bodies without damaging existing interest. And of course, a fundamental principle of making any new habitat is that you don't damage something that's, I'll put air quotes here, more interesting, more important whilst you're doing it. It's obviously completely destructive to damage other wetlands, for example. Historically, people often dug ponds into peatland. We would not do that now, of course, because that would be entirely the wrong thing to do. So we do it by being careful about where we put it, but the guiding principle is that we're trying to put clean, unpolluted water back into the landscape, because that's the biggest reason. That's actually the biggest reason for those increases I showed you. We put clean water back into otherwise quite generally polluted landscapes.
Great, thanks very much, Jeremy. Yes, sir, please, go ahead.
Thanks to the entire panel's fascinating discussion. My question is directed towards Jacob. Hi, Jacob.
Can you tell us who you are?
I'm Amitabh Shorkar. I work at the interface of public health and sustainability. I'm with the Graduate Institute in Geneva. So my question is for the Jacob. You talk about the EU restoration law and the implementation. I'm really interested to know that, because while we go for the implementation, and that's the challenging the scientists we have been confronting, like what would be the organization structure, the cadre, the training, and the entire body of scientific management of implementation for this ecosystem service. So what would be the likely design right now, or the structure right now EU has in mind, or maybe on paper? Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's a very good question. I mean, it's one thing to have a proposal for a law, it's another thing to have a law in place, and it's another thing to make it happen. As I mentioned in one of my slides, one of the big implementation blocks are basically the national restoration plans. So what the law proposes is targets for restoration across the EU and applying to each member state. But then each member state, so that could be France, it could be Italy, it could be Slovenia, has to prepare their own national restoration plan of how they would address the targets. So if they're for targets for wetlands, for example, how would that member state, where would it aim to put in place some of the restoration of the wetlands? What specific regions? How would they involve local communities and stakeholders in the process? And how would they bid for financing to be able to make some of these things happen. I mean, those are some of the basic elements. Now, this is where, in fact, the whole communities of knowledge of scientists, of practitioners who are involved in restoration is very important, because across the EU, member states will be designing these plans, and they will be looking in some very often for additional expertise and knowledge and know-how. And like one of the previous presentations, I think it was from Arnaud, was talking about upscaling, and from Waterlands about upscaling and knowledge practices and spreading that knowledge. That will be a very important part of the implementation. Yeah, I think this is where both the scientific and the practitioner community, if I can call it that, can play a big role in helping and in being part of the process of developing the national restoration plans, being active in being involved with member states developing these plans. These will be public. It will require public participation, and that's where this will be an important role for researchers and practitioners to play a big role.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Jacob. I've actually got a question for you, Alessio, and that is, you talked about the draft resolution on nature-based solutions. Maybe you can articulate to us why that's so important to implementing the convention's mission.
Yeah, of course. When we talk about the implementation of the convention, we refer to the fourth Ramsar strategic plan, 2016-2024. In this case, about strategic goal 3, we refer to wisely use of all wetlands, and target 12, which is about restoration. So all the countries have, all the contracting parties have a specific target in terms of improving their capacity in restoring wetlands. So our projects, I think I can speak also for the other projects, we can really create a platform of support for all the countries, not only those that are involved in our project, but also other contracting parties that can benefit from our work.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I'm Pascal Delille from the EU delegation here in Geneva. I had a question not related to the EU restoration law, more a general question to all of you as specialists of wetlands. There can be conflict or complementarity in the uses of water, as we know, and in a warming climate, we hear more and more this kind of dilemma about water for agriculture, water for biodiversity. So do you, as a community of practice, have views about where do we go from wetlands, where do reservoir for agriculture start, and do you see synergies or conflicts between these two logics?
Great question. Thank you. Who wants to tackle that? Sectoral trade-offs and synergies. Please go ahead, Arno.
Thank you for the question. I appreciate it, because it's a topic that's been pretty hot in the last weeks, especially in France. I think this is where we should really bring in the landscape approach to wetlands restoration and conservation. I think we need to think about water uses and rethink them in a way that we need to drastically move away from intensive uses. So my views on this is that we should also, in a wider context of wetland restoration, we should also think about how agricultural uses can be integrated within this landscape approach, which should underpin all activities and then really spread across the policies. Thank you.
Yes, please, go ahead. Hold it a minute. We'll come back, Jeremy. Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Marianne Corouble. I'm policy officer at Medwet. I have a question for Jeremy. You were referring to creating new pumps, but I wanted to ask you, what about preventing the destruction of existing pumps, which is quite a tragedy? And how do you work with local authorities to create the socioeconomic incentive to keep these pumps alive? because it's so easy for a local authority to create parking or anything else, which is much more cost effective in terms of revenue than managing a bond. So thank you.
Okay.
Do you want to take
I'll do that quickly and
yeah,
I'll do the other. Okay, so quickly, I would emphasize there are so many ponds. There are still a lot of ponds. There are millions of ponds. There are maybe 3.5 million ponds just in Europe. So there's a lot of ponds. So we would try to prioritize those that are most important. So the first thing is to find out as much as you can about the ponds and to tell people which ones are most important to protect from a biodiversity perspective. And we're applying a system a little bit like that in the UK. It's not great yet, but it's getting there. And I would suggest that's one way of doing it. In the end, I suppose the only thing is you have to tell people how important small water bodies are, so they think they should be protecting them. That's in the end the way to do it. I don't have another solution really apart from that. They have to know that they're important. It's information like I've just been showing you that explains to people why they should be concerned. Can I just talk quickly about the farming situation? A lot of the problems with agriculture are, of course, to do with, well, there's two big problems, the abstraction of water from the environment, which doesn't actually affect small water bodies so much because they're often in places where they're not affected by those sorts of water sources. Not to say it's not a big problem, but it's maybe less important for the ponds we're talking about. The bigger problems are to do with diffuse pollution. And I think the solutions to those are very difficult for bigger water bodies. In the meantime, we've got a biodiversity crisis and a climate crisis, so we should get on with the small water body solutions which can tackle those quite quickly, even in intensively managed landscapes, intensively cultivated landscapes. The best result I showed you was in modern British farmland, not in some kind of paradise. It was in modern industrialized farmland, and we've done that in that farmed landscape. So I think it's quite possible with small waters because they have very small catchments, or quite small catchments, and it's the catchment that's important, and the more natural the catchment, the better the quality of the fresh water will be. That's quite hard to create for big water bodies, big rivers, big lakes, big wetlands. It's much easier for small ones. That's the key to their success.
Great, thank you very much, Jeremy. Now, I'm afraid that just to respect the time of the session, I'm afraid we have to come to a close. I'm sure our panel are not running off anywhere, so if you want to talk to them further after the session, please do so. I think the number of different projects that are embodied within this sort of NetworkNature program is a real resource for the nature-based solutions community, but also a real resource for parties to the Ramsar Convention, given the experience it's got on community networking, some of the new insights on the science and on different types of wetland issues and challenges. And I understand that they're also creating a database that highlights exactly where some of these resources are so that countries can go and extract the latest information from this network of research programs. So hopefully people will be able to tap into that and use that in terms of their relationship with water and in implementation of the convention. I wish you all a successful afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to our panel and to Jacob online, and have a good continuation of your COP. Thank you.